We are pleased to have you guys here. So this is John Coe. He was an Innovation Fellowship alum, took a company out of the fellowship called Prescient Surgical, where he's still CEO. We also have Miles Rosen with us. Miles actually completed the grad class and then joined forces with an innovation fellow and founded a company called Pelvalon, which was just successfully acquired, which is why Miles is hiking all summer and traveling, which is awesome. And then Amanda, are you online? Okay,
yes,
Amanda.
hi, I'm here on the Zoom.
Nice to meet, or nice to see you. Amanda French is also with us. Amanda's an Innovation Fellowship alum as well, and took a project that became Emmy out of the fellowship. And so we've got a great panel. We're going to talk about 3 different payment models, and we'll have some discussion in between each one. So John, take it away.
So Prescient Surgical, you guys know what prescient means? Because I did not when my co-founder suggested that word, but I pretended I did. And then I went and looked it up online. But the idea was with CMS coming out with never events in certain surgical procedures, particularly for what you're seeing up here. This is a colorectal surgery. The other one's a gynec procedure. Infections in those 2 procedures were, if you were above the outlier hospital, you were going to get dinged for them, right? If you guys are familiar with GDPR, you follow what Google's done, what Apple's done. They just kind of look at it like it's the cost of doing business. So, you know, capitation, full value-based care, risk models, they're not there yet. I still think we are prescient about it. But at Prescient, we developed Clean Incision, which effectively cleans out the wound while the surgeon is operating, removes bacteria that could cause an infection, puts it safely into a suction canister. A lot of the surgeons also augment that with topical antimicrobials, right? So instead of delivering those antimicrobials through an IV, you're kind of marinating the incision with antibiotics so that when this device is gone, you have a protective halo effect that prevents any infection from occurring. So I won't go too much more into the product, but problem, 15% of patients get infections. Here are all the downstream consequences and costs that the hospitals and the patients themselves will face, right? $10 billion spent every year treating SSI. A bed in a hospital in ward with an infection patient that you can't leave open for another potentially profitable procedure, right? These are all the types of arguments that we put together in our economic packages. But I think someone up here said they don't like the UI of Medicare. I think Anthony's talking about how many MACs are there?
I can't remember right now.
Okay.
Like
Less than
30.
4,000.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So for a DRG-based medical device, especially a surgical device, we have 4,000 payment provider payers that we have to go out for approval. There's no UI, there's no process. There's not even a great consultant like Nancy you can hire. You have to kind of get lucky by hoping that you chose the right salesperson that has a pretty good idea of how to navigate this process. So this just kind of gives you an idea of those 4,000, the regions where we put some sales reps. I can tell you, well, I won't tell you what regions we didn't have the best sales reps, kind of the old school, push it to the surgeon and have them use it. The ones that were able to navigate this process were the most successful. And it's a lot of the same things that Nancy talked about for reimbursement, right? We focus a lot on economics. We focus a ton on clinical evidence. But I will point to that first bullet and tell you that reimbursement still matters here, right? And probably above and beyond that, budget of the procedures that you're going after matters more. So the procedures I played in were generally reimbursed from 10 to 20K. They were incredibly high volume too. So they might be on that cusp of being a cost center versus a profit center. A couple of years ago, I teamed up with a plastic surgeon here at Stanford. He was a customer first, and he said, "No, I have an idea. I don't want to work on another idea like that. These are too hard." Until I started to tally up the prices of a reconstructed breast implant, of the sleeve that they put the breast implant in, the throwaway breast implant they use for sizing. that procedure is reimbursed at $100,000 to $150,000. So that just takes this margin that you can play in, and we sold that project, but if we were to commercialize it, $500 product just disappears like a drop of water in that reimbursement. $500 product here, as you can see, we're able to increase our pricing, is actually a pretty significant hit, especially in some hospitals where they might just be floating over that profitability. Product positioning and messaging. Our MACs are value analysis committees, right? What a value analysis committee really is a price comparison committee. So it's like the buyers at Costco, right? They're saying, I have an equivalent product. I'm going to look at it like a commodity. I'm going to choose the cheaper one. So this top right one, we started positioning our product against Provino and negative pressure wound therapy, which was really a $600 product versus the product that we were replacing. The legacy product we were replacing that was $100. And I point out that price chart at the bottom because there's incredible pricing elasticity at hospitals, right? And it's a big reason why they fight to keep you out so much, because once it gets into supply chain and it's in that weekly ordering process, you kind of have them. And I was surprised the first calls that I made, and I'd say, hey, you know, COVID and inflation and supply chain, we're going to be increasing the price by $200 for you guys. And you get a little bit of blowback, and then the next PO that you got the higher price. So it takes incredible amount of sales resources to hit all of these individual systems. The clinical, the product positioning is what really hits with the surgeon and your kind of clinical stakeholders, where you have to have the whole package, and it's hand-to-hand combat when you go in with these value analysis committees, which once you've seen one, you've seen one. It's really not a generalizable process as much as we would like it to be.
Hi, everyone. I am Amanda French, and I was the co-founder and CEO of Emmy from the initial concept at Stanford Biodesign all the way through our ultimate acquisition last year by Simple Health. And what I want to talk about today is our initial approach as a direct-to-consumer product, to kind of give that for some comparison. So at the next slide, we can start just by anchoring on the unmet need that we observed, which is that birth control pills are the most common form of contraception, also one of the most common entry points into the healthcare system. And yet the biggest challenge that people on the pill face, which was adherence, had remained unsolved before Emmy. This is a bigger problem than I think people initially think about. 82% of sexually active women will try birth control pills, and the majority of those people, and I was one who can attest to that from personal experience, would miss at least one pill per month. It was one of those challenges that you might think, oh, if you miss a pill here and there, is it really such a big deal? Well, it turned out when we looked at the numbers from CDC, there are actually 1 million unplanned pregnancies in the US each year among people on the pill. And so it seemed like a huge problem worth solving. If we go to the next slide, what I will share is we also kind of looked at what were some of the biggest stakeholder challenges, so to speak, and we looked at this to kind of think through various business models down the line. Something that really validated the fact that this is a bothersome issue for patients is the fact that a substantial portion of people on the pill are discontinuing due to challenges that they're having, side effects, and other sources of stress due to missing the pill and not taking it regularly. So I'll start by showing what we invented and where it was at Stanford Biodesign versus where it is now. Our concept was that we wanted to devise a way to improve adherence for birth control pill users who are trying to prevent pregnancy in order to reduce the number of missed pills per cycle. So it's a connected digital health product with a hardware device that tracks birth control pill consumption and a mobile app that sends alerts as well as personalized feedback based on the patient's adherence. So we can jump ahead to the next slide. That's where we started. Here's where we are now. So we're on the market. We've been on the market for several years with an award-winning smart birth control pill case and a HIPAA compliant app Studies on effectiveness were not necessary in order to get to the market, but kind of similar to what Jonathan said, we knew that having this information would improve the value proposition and really validate what we've built. And we've been able to show that we drive an 80% reduction in missed pills. So the technology really does work. This technology is one where actually you can argue that you can save healthcare systems money within the year because of the fact that pregnancies are 9 to 10 months. And so we knew, and we still do, that ultimately there may be arguments to make in order to sell into payer systems. But we wanted to go as fast as possible, which is why we started direct to consumer. So in the next slide, I show what our initial thinking was in terms of potential revenue channels, really starting with a very low price point upfront for the case. And then we expected that we would charge an app subscription directly to patients every month. We also had on our radar, and still do, various other partnership opportunities and distribution channels, ultimately looking at reimbursement as well. But what I'll share in the next slide is kind of where we actually landed on the pricing and why we did. So the actual pricing that we landed on was even simpler than what I shared before. The device is $99, and the app is free to use. The benefits of going to market this way are shared here. Speed to market was really important to us, especially as a Class 1 exempt product. We were able to avoid some of the stakeholder limitations that have been discussed today by aligning the payer with the end user. And connecting directly with the patient through the direct-to-consumer channel actually has really helped us continue to drive iterations and be very close to that customer, which ultimately does actually support B2B opportunities as well. So direct-to-consumer is kind of famous for being challenging. And so what I wanted to talk through are what are some of the core success criteria that need to be true in order for direct-to-consumer to work in digital health. Some of the ways that you can kind of study to see if it's going to work are: one, validating willingness to pay. We did this very early on by doing pricing research, putting up test campaigns online, and even driving orders for pre-order sales. All of those figures drive into the ultimate success criteria for direct-to-consumer, which is favorable unit economics. So there's a couple of things that we think about: lifetime value of the customers, the overall dollars that they're spending, and customer acquisition cost is the amount of dollars you're spending on ads or other channels in order to actually acquire the customer. It might be analogous to having sales reps out in the field, but direct to consumer, I think we've all seen thousands of ads, and so that's the most common way to do it. Ultimately, you want a really healthy ratio between lifetime value and customer acquisition cost. At Emmy, we always focused on showing that you could get at least 3 times the revenue from the dollars that you're investing. And then kind of the last piece of this is, for direct to consumer, you have very different acquisition channels than you would for a product where you're seeking reimbursement. And all of them kind of add up to build the full story. At Emmy, we focused on PR to drive awareness. We ran influencer campaigns for consideration of the product. And ultimately, paid ads and then social referrals are what drove the ultimate sales that we're still seeing. So in the last slide, I'll just share, what if your lifetime value is not big enough? What if, for example, it turns out the ads that you have to spend money on to acquire a customer kind of only even out with the price point of the product itself? The strategy that we considered at Emmy is just expanding the number of products that you're offering. And this was one of the huge advantages of our merger with Simple Health last year. It enabled us to really expand beyond just the one product, so that if you're investing in those ads for acquiring customers, acquiring patients, you can offer many different services and products over time.
All right. So I was CEO with Calvalon a little over 10 years ago. We started it, came out of the class, and then progressed all the way, most recently through acquisition. And the device itself was for women with loss of bowel control, fecal incontinence, something I didn't know very much about, but it's a huge issue, especially in women who've had complications, maybe child delivery, and as they age, both bladder and bowel function. And what made it such an interesting, I think Stanford Biodesign need is there really was this gap. You had diet and exercise as treatment for this condition. And then you had an invasive surgical implant that was over $35,000 implant.
And there really wasn't a lot in between. So when we would talk to gynecologists and urogynes and some of these physicians, they'd say, hey, we'd love to have something that could come in that middle that could fill this gap in our treatment algorithm. So that's what really, I think, keyed us in early. I think what I maybe wasn't as aware of back then was what implications that had on reimbursement, which, as Nancy said, is really one of the most important things for the ultimate success of your product. And I think, unfortunately, you sometimes get penalized for innovation in our system. And so if you want to play in this space, there's pros and cons. The pro is you have this differentiated product. You're unique. You have great marketing positioning. The con is it's going to be harder and longer to establish a new code and payment because there's nothing like it in that area. As opposed to, and I remember talking to a guy who was developing a competitor in this space, where he's like, I'm just going to develop another neurostimulator. It's going to replace one of the ones that's already out there. We're going to use the codes that are already in place. I'm not even going to worry about having to get new codes. I'm just going to go out there and start selling. And, that worked for him. That's like a good approach. There's pros and cons to each of those methods. So that was sort of the early phase. The device itself is a vaginal insert similar to where, say, a tampon would go, and it can expand to help support the rectum in such a way that it prevents accidents from occurring. So an important part of this is that it's non-surgical, and we'll talk about that later. There's sort of a category of devices that governs reimbursement for such products. We went through the de novo pathway in the FDA. Does people know what that is? De novo is? That's an interesting thing, and Nancy made the point you want to try and understand your reimbursement pathway as early as possible, and this was a good example of that. So, there's de novo. Another way you could potentially go is 510K, where you claim predicate to some other device. And sometimes there's a gray zone where you can maybe go 510K or you can go de novo. If you're trying to get a new reimbursement code, can anyone think of a reason why you might want to go de novo? Turns out that when we went through the reimbursement process and we actually were reading the application before going through the FDA, there's somewhere on the application where it says, if you went 510K, please list your predicates and explain to us, if you're asking for a different payment, why you claimed predicate with the FDA, but you're saying that you're different from the reimbursement standpoint. So the point is your track record will stay with you. And so it is, as soon as you can map out the reimbursement strategy, the better, because it's going to influence how you approach FDA and some of these other things. Clinical studies, as John mentioned, are very important. We'll talk about that as well, but investing in a product, even if it's not required for FDA, getting the clinical evidence will definitely help. So the journey, we got FDA cleared through the de novo pathway in 2015. In 2016 and 2017, we didn't have a reimbursement code in place. It's a brand new device. There's nothing that described it. So hospital systems had no way to build this easily. But when you're in that phase, there are things that you can do. And one of the things that you can do is you can go to private payers and you can try and get reimbursement on a case-by-case basis. There's miscellaneous codes, so you can submit it. It's kind of a pain in the ass. You have to submit all this documentation. They'll probably get denied, and you have to explain to the payer, like, no, you're currently paying $30,000. This device is like 1,000 something. And they're like, oh, okay, well, yeah, maybe I will pay for this. So we kind of fought that battle. We're able to get some big health systems on board and some payers on board doing that. And we also were going to Medicare, to CMS, and trying to understand, okay, what does this actual application process look like? What are we going to have to do to submit? So we do that, and we finally submit in 2018, and a code is created. It's a big day, exciting. Everybody's got good endorphins. We're ready to go off to the races. And later that year, they announced the payment, and instead of being the 1,000 something that private payers were paying, they put it in for expense 128. And we said, well, wait a second, why is that? That's inconsistent with everything that was out there. And they said, well, You know, we actually just compared your device to something for a different condition. They also pulled like a car wash part they found on the website, kind of combined the two, but that's a separate thing. So we said, okay, well, that's inconsistent with the regulation. So we spent the next 2 years appealing this and going through different, different processes to write this. And it turns out there is, and actually we were sort of the first guinea pig that went through this system. And by the way, this is for this, we're talking about, it's called PICS codes, or DMEPOS, DME, POS. These are codes for devices like wearables or glucose monitor, or basically stuff that you use outside of the hospital that you take home with you. So it's a growing area of medicine. It governs a lot of different innovations. And because it's evolving, it used to be just kind of these funky like wheelchairs and stuff like that in the 80s when the system was created. Now with all these companies that are in this space, they actually revamped the system and they're trying to put more transparency around it. So we kind of helped forge that path when we were working with them. But the way that it works is if you are truly novel, and they list criteria. So you should, if you're considering this path, you can actually look it up and say, okay, do we meet the novelty requirement for these 5 things? Is it a new indication? Do we have different mechanical components, different function? And you can kind of put yourself on a grid and determine if that's new. We also then had to get doctors at this point, flying in to DC, meeting with senators then calling CMS and saying, hey, you guys really need to address this. It seems like you made an error here. And even with all that, it takes a while. Eventually they did change it. They corrected it to the right amount that was consistent with private payers, which allowed us to be able to go out to hospital systems around the country. And they were excited to do it. At the very end, they said, hey, we're actually happy to do this because it ultimately will save us money. It took a while. So I think for me, the takeaways, number one, when you're trying to pick what innovation or what thing you want to develop, should you even go after it? Does it fit under an existing code? Yes or no. And then as Dan said, does it pay enough? And there's different ways to think about that. I think creating a new code and new reimbursement can be very fruitful. If the market size is big enough, this can be a great way to go. But if it's not a big market, you're probably not going to convince an investor to say spend $30–40 million in 7–8 years, to do something that doesn't have a big market. So I would say if you're going to create a new reimbursement code or a new payment, really make sure that the market size justifies that, or go a pathway where there's an existing code and an existing payment. Payment is the other thing that trips people up, as Nancy was saying, because you might come up with this cool thing and the existing payment is $50. And no matter how cool your thing is, you're only ever going to get that $50, unfortunately. So really got to think like, can we get the, whatever percent margins, 80% gross margins or whatever off the existing payment if we want to make that work. And then if you do it, I think, as we mentioned, like doing the reimbursement from the very beginning, making that part of your FDA strategy, making it part of your clinical strategy. And I think engaging whoever your stakeholder is, in this case, it was CMS, the government agency, early on in the process. And I tend to do it with not very open-ended, because if you ask them, hey, what do you think? They'll ask for everything. But going in, working with an expert or consultant and saying, okay, we've done the research. Here's where we think our device fits. Here's the reason why per your own policy. Do you agree? Yes or no? And you can get that feedback early, so hopefully you avoid any sort of delays in the process. And then once you're there, it's a great position to be, because all of a sudden now you have this code, you're in a new market, you've got great payment, and it creates a lot of tailwinds once you get to that spot. So yeah, that was our story.